Okay, hello everybody. Oops, I gotta take off my camera. All right. Hi everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm reading mic activity. Welcome back on this fine Sunday here. Thank you so much for sticking around. Friendly reminder to those who might be listening for the first time on IG Live. You want to see the slides, you want to have access to the discussion or something like that, you can click the link in my bio. The link in my bio will take you to the Zoom session we're currently running right now. You're welcome to jump in and see the slides. If not, stick around on the IG Live Zoom chat or the IG live stream. Um, Periodically, I will try to pop in and see people's comments as I'm lecturing on IG Live. However, do know that I don't usually respond to IG Live comments until we get to the Q&A portion. If for any reason or by chance you happen to be watching this video already recorded in the past on YouTube, welcome as well. But feel free to hit the like and the subscribe button, share with your friends, comment, tell your people about me. We're gonna. I'm hoping to grow my channel, grow my presence, and maybe we can build something off of this. We're already getting somewhere. Um, let's go ahead and move forward. Also, if you want access to the slides without my big head blocking everything, um, you can go and join my Patreon. You do not necessarily need to pay for it. All of the material is free access, okay? Um, but if you do, you can kick me some money, some financial support. I'll never say no to that. But anyway, let's get started. Here we go. So, where we left off in our discussion, we've been going through the entire timeline of the United States of America, right? And just last week, we were talking about what it looked like to be active in the Civil War. What was going on the Confederate side? What was going on the Union side? How did Lincoln try to politically maneuver and position in such a way that he didn't lose massive amounts of support? And ultimately, what ended up happening was slavery is ended. Black people join the fight in the Union Army. The Confederates respond by getting their slaves and other free black people to fight in the Union Army or the Confederacy. And essentially, the Confederates lose. Okay. And that's where we left off. The Confederates have lost the war. And now here we are at the top of basically a new chapter in American history. And this is a chapter in which slavery is now officially ended. So let's go on and jump into this, okay? So here we are, okay? It's not necessarily immediate, so don't take the header up there as if to say like almost immediately Lincoln is assassinated, right? Um, but it's soon after the end of the Civil War that Lincoln begins to have a change of heart about black people. And this is where I suppose the revisionist history might then characterize Lincoln posthumously as somehow having the best interest of black people in mind, is because by the time we get to the end of the Civil War, Lincoln has realized that all of these black people who fought on behalf of the Union, sacrificed their lives, risked their lives in many cases, used a lot of wisdom and cunning and strategy and intelligence. They're fighting on behalf of a country that technically wasn't even theirs. If you recall, I don't think we ever talked about this. There's a lot of things I can't possibly hit every nook and cranny on American history. I don't think we ever talked about the Dred Scott decision in detail. But for those of you who don't know, the Dred Scott decision was a Supreme Court case in which, please mute your microphone unless you have a question. Um, but the Dred Scott decision was a circumstance in which um, enslaved people, including a man named Dred Scott, had sued for freedom on the basis that they were being denied their constitutional American rights. And so the Dred Scott decision essentially saw the Supreme Court rule that people who were enslaved in the United States are not necessary, they're not citizens of the United States and therefore are not entitled to the protections offered by the United States, right? So on the back end of this, here you have all of these stateless black people, essentially, who are fighting on behalf of a country that they can't officially call theirs in any capacity. And like most of no, another human being, it comes to Lincoln's surprise that they're not these animalistic, beastly, impulsive people who just want racial retribution. It turns out that they're actually just people. So Lincoln, in a speech on April 11th, is essentially responding to the victory and encouraging America that he's going to reconstruct and reunify the nation in a way that positions both the North and the South as all the better for this reunification. And in his speech, he literally says, or alludes, but says that he's considering giving these black men the right to vote, and at the very least, the black men who served the Union, who risked their lives for the Union, um, who are still alive today, at least the ones who survived the war, and their descendants, they deserve the right to vote, at least. They deserve to have a place in American society because of the debt they're paying that isn't even really theirs. Okay. And so interestingly, this is where John Wilkes Booth, on April 11th, 1865, stands up in the middle of the crowd as Lincoln is giving the speech, and he shouts incredibly loudly, that is the last speech he will ever make. And what John Wilkes Booth is responding to is exactly what we've been talking about this entire time, is he's responding to the idea that, like, yeah, here's Abraham Lincoln, who's basically the nigger president. He's the president that wants to support the nigger. He doesn't have the white man's best interest in mind. And it's likely that John Wilkes Booth, up until this point, has been internalizing all of the division that Democrats had been sowing. Hey, look at what Lincoln is doing for black people. Look at what he's doing for slavery. Aren't you pissed? Don't you want to do something about that? Better vote Democrat in the midterms. So here's Lincoln now, who is essentially kind of confirming everyone's bias, even though the entire time up until the Emancipation Proclamation, he really wasn't interested in protecting Black rights and freedoms or anything like that. So, this one subtle move in which he says, I'm really considering giving Black men who fought and risked their lives for our country the right to vote, then elicits vitriolic responses yet again. And if you've seen any of my lectures on YouTube, available freely, around the topic of white rage, here is, I don't want to say the first time, right? Um, but this is one of those pivotal moments in which you get an incremental step towards a more equal, fair, or just society. And in doing so, it elicits vitriolic and sometimes violent responses from white people. And those vitriolic and violent responses, in this case, ends up being that John Wilkes Booth, 3 days later, then assassinates Abraham Lincoln. Okay. Now, I want to acknowledge the elephant in the room because something happened over the last like 12 hours. I woke up in the middle of the night. I went to sleep early and woke up just to go to the bathroom, but I don't know, some kind of random instinct prompted me to open my phone and check Instagram. And immediately what I saw in my feed was that some guy had stormed a dinner and tried to assassinate Donald Trump, or at least that's who we believe he was going after. Right. So I want to acknowledge the elephant in the room here that as I'm talking about presidential assassinations here, at no point am I trying to like do this because this guy just suddenly showed up. And if you've been following my channel up until this point, right, it's very clear that we have just been going through the timeline of American history. So it is purely coincidental that I'm talking about a presidential assassination. Even though Donald Trump necessarily wasn't assassinated, there was still an attempt. So I'm not encouraging that. I'm not even really going to comment on it. I have nothing to do with that. But here is where we are. And this is the response that essentially Lincoln entertaining the idea of black people having the right to vote illicits. So he hasn't officially moved on their behalf. He hasn't actually done anything. It's actually just that he's just thinking about it. And in just publicly announcing that he's thinking about it, it's enough to then get this response. The GIF that you're seeing on my left here, this is a reenactment of that event. The event itself was not filmed. There were no cameras there. Cameras are very difficult to come by in this period. That is a reenactment, and I just give that there because it is a little bit of energy anyway, right? So pause on the Lincoln assassination because we're going to get somewhere. Okay, so hold that in the back burner. Now what you have is slavery's over. It's ended. It's officially ended. Black people no longer officially are owned by other human beings of any kind. Okay. And so here is where it opens up this Pandora's box where I showed you last week images of all kinds of slaves, the image of this guy. Essentially, he's a house nigger. You have lots of pictures of people with their slaves. I don't think I showed this middle image here of these three white guys and their slave in the background. But that's what you're looking at, okay? And what's essentially happening here is that now that the Confederacy has officially essentially been dissolved and the country is undergoing reunification, you have this interesting phenomenon where lots of black people are beginning to abandon the slave plantation in the South. They're abandoning their roles as part of the Confederacy. They're trying to figure out and find their own way. And many of these black people are very quick to tell the white people around them that the ways that they were acting, all subservient and nice and kiss ass and things like that, that's not actually who they are. In fact, many of these black people fucking hate their guts. They don't ever want to see them again. They wish they were dead, but they don't have the audacity to kill these people themselves. But good riddance is essentially the attitude you're going to get from somebody who has been enduring all kinds of hell around abuse, around mistreatment, and essentially just having to put up with it. Elena says, a bit late. Was it Lincoln? Was it that Lincoln was actually starting to sincerely embrace the idea of equality? I wouldn't necessarily go that far, right? I mean, obviously, to some extent, such a radical political pivot during this time is certainly going to make it's significant. He never said at any point in time that like all black people in America should have equality or equal status to white people. And it wasn't, that was never his position. So to some extent, you might say he might be implying that black people should have equality, especially if he's entertaining the idea of giving them the right to vote, right? So in one sense, you might be able to allude to that, but there's no official statement of record of him saying that that's something that he wanted. But no one pushed him to push for the equal rights. To my knowledge, no. To my knowledge, it is of Lincoln's own conscience that he feels that if black people who technically are stateless, if slavery is ended, then the Dred Scott decision no longer applies. But these people are not necessarily American citizens either now, technically, right? So, in Lincoln's mind, the idea is that these stateless people who are fighting on behalf of the Union, they should at least get someplace officially recognized in American society, and that might just be giving them the right to vote. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So back to my point here is you've got black people basically pulling off the mask. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Wiz. It's phenomenal. It's like the black version of The Wizard of Oz, and it has Michael Jackson in it as the Scarecrow. But there's a scene in which the Wicked Witch, Eveline, dies and gets flushed down a toilet, and all of her little evil minions begin to like take off their little ugly suits. They're all dancing and they're happy, singing their black version of Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead. That's essentially what's going on here. And you can understand why they would feel that way. Okay. But now there are some white people that are so dependent on their slaves that like literally they can't survive without them. There are people who are so old and like essentially crippled. They can't make it down the stairs. They can't grow their own crops. It's not like they have easy access to the local marketplace where they can go and get their own food, let alone cook it. Many of these people have known slave labor their entire life. And when I go back to this talking point I mentioned a few weeks ago, he's on down the road, right? When I make this talking point about uh, the Southern identity, something about their identity is rooted in owning other people as property. It really is that bad that, like, essentially, they can't even so much as wipe their own ass. And I'm exaggerating, I'm embellishing in that regard. But essentially, you could imagine it like that. It would be like just basic things that you would expect other people to be able to do for themselves. These people don't know the first thing about it. Okay. So many people find themselves in positions where they just die. They starve to death. No one comes back to save them or to care for them or anything. You had a few circumstances in which the house niggers of the plantations would stick around and care for their masters and willfully did so. That's also happening too. But it's I would describe it more like a spectrum of responses. You have some black people that the moment they hear they're free, they're like, bro, I've been spitting in your food. I've been pissing in your food. I've been doing all kinds of shit. One time I took a smudge of shit and I smeared it along the side of your bread and it tasted funky, but you ate it anyway. And they're like, they're saying these things. They're just coming out with it. Right. So as Steven says, ease on down the road, right? That's essentially what's happening here. Okay. And then there are other black people, like I said, that have essentially lost their way of life. They're not necessarily like beholden to the slave master in the sense of like a house nigger, but at the same time, the only thing that they've really known their entire life is slavery. So now that that gets taken away, even though they have freedom, well, what the hell do they do with their freedom? What do you do? What's the next step? Where do you go? How do you assure yourself that you have stability in this new world? So there's like a spectrum of responses, and it almost becomes like a humanitarian crisis. That at some level, you have Black people that immediately take off in search of lost loved ones who were sold somewhere. There's very few or unreliable records about who they were sold to, which direction you could go in to find them, right? In certain cases, you have people that like are going out and posting missing posters for their lost loved ones. We're looking for so and so. They go by this name. They kind of look like this. If you see them, please let them know we're looking for them. And blah. It literally becomes a crisis. It is a humanitarian crisis in which some people are so devoted to finding their loved ones. There's and I only know this because of the book. I don't even necessarily know this because of any other information, but from the book, it says that one man literally walked barefoot off of the plantation, chose a direction, didn't matter what direction he was headed in, but chose a direction and just continued walking it for nearly 600 miles looking for his wife and kids. So when I say looking for his wife and kids, it's likely the case that he was the one who was sold and traded, and he has absolutely no idea where he is. And his only goal, his only mission is to reunify with his family. And for some people, it really is the only thing you really have is to kind of lick your finger, stick it in the wind, follow the wind, and see where it takes you. Okay. And so that's what's happening here. Okay. Now, in some cases, some Black people are easily able to find their family members, right? Maybe their family members are still in the same state. Maybe there's an abundance of information about where their family members are located and how they can go about finding them and things like that. And that's the case that happens for Solomon Northup. Well, in his case, he actually escaped from slavery before emancipation, but he was still able to reunify with his family 12 years later, right? But there are other people who, even after they come into contact with their lost loved ones, some spouses have remarried. during the extended time of separation, had different kids. Some of them reunited and were able to figure things out. Other people just fell apart and had to figure out their own way, right? It's just a complicated circumstance in which every permutation possible, everything that could possibly happen here, right, wrong, good, bad, disastrous, or miraculous, is happening essentially all at once. Okay. So, as I said to you, this is becoming a humanitarian crisis that you essentially have these black people across America that are like refugees. Okay. And many of them, I don't want to say all of them, but many of them simply don't know what the next steps are. And it's going to be impossible to tell them what the next steps are when they don't have a home, they don't have a land they can call theirs. They don't necessarily have money. No one's giving them reparations or telling them, hey, go down to your local bank. The federal government is funding an initiative for blah, blah, blah. You can get yourself started on an easy transition in American society. Here's what you do, steps one, two, three. Nobody's giving them that. So you have people that are homeless, people that are camping, people that are essentially everywhere. And like I said, they're stateless. Now that they're free, the Dred Scott decision ruled that enslaved people weren't U.S. citizens. So what do we do here, right? So the federal government is trying to figure out, excuse me, the federal government is trying to figure out what it can do to resolve the refugee crisis. And so despite the fact that Abraham Lincoln has been assassinated, the Republicans still hold two-thirds majority in Congress, and with Andrew Johnson as a Democrat president. So essentially, the goal, even Andrew Johnson is in on this to some extent, is to figure out what to do about the Black crisis in America. So Congress creates what's called the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. Okay, this is colloquially referred to as the Freedmen's Bureau. And essentially, their mission is fairly straightforward. They're going to be responsible for making sure that all of these freedmen get some kind of land ownership. This is where the 2 acres and the mule thing comes from. They obtain land, they gain education, they're able to negotiate labor contracts that allow them to accumulate some money and not necessarily be exploited, basically giving Black people a basic level of education where they can read, they can write, they can do arithmetic, they know opportunity and the distinction between opportunity and exploitation. And while these people are being rehabilitated and essentially assimilated into American society, they are being given food, medical care, and transportation, etc. Okay. So the images that you see here, this picture up above me, that is a real image. I refuse to use AI in this, so never think that I'm using AI here. Any of these old photos that you see, especially now that the camera has been invented, you'll be able to kind of peer into a window of really interesting history. Stephen says, I've always felt that if the US government had actually given slaves reparations when they should have, there would have been an economic boom. And that is likely the case. I don't really see much evidence against that. I would even go so far as to say, despite the fact that the US government never gave Black people reparations, there are several examples in history of Black people finding economic opportunities to flourish and thrive. And the only thing that undermined them was when a neighboring white town found out about it and then went to go massacre the entire town or something like that. And that's happened numerous times throughout American history. But Stephen, you are absolutely correct. Um, Now, getting back to this, where are you going to house all of these Black people that you're trying to feed, you're trying to educate, you're trying to get them essentially assimilated to American society? Well, what better place to house many of these people than the abandoned lands that the former Confederates had occupied? Okay, so after the war, after all of the gunfights and the battles and the cannons going off, certain people dying, you have a phenomenon in which there were many former slaveholders who simply never returned to their land, either because they were taken as prisoners of war or they were killed during the conflict. So, not all of the land in the South is entirely abandoned, right? There are still people who belong to the Confederacy that survive and live. and we'll be talking about them fairly shortly, probably next week. However, a lot of houses, homes, plantations are simply abandoned. So what the Freedmen's Bureau is doing here is they're turning all of these abandoned lands into refugee centers, camps for the homeless, centers where they can feed the hungry. They can care for people who are orphaned. Yes, there are children who are orphaned because perhaps their parents who were compelled to go and fight for the Confederacy had died, right? So like I said, humanitarian crisis, and essentially the Bureau was about to fulfill its mission. And part of its mission is specifically stated was to give these people land, give Black people land. Okay. And they were just about to turn over all of this abandoned land, all of the former Confederate owned land over to them when they received an order from the President of the United States, Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson is ordering that all of the land that is currently being used as refugee centers must be turned over to white owners. Okay. Now, find, if you can't find a slave owner, if you can't find the one who that land originally belonged to, or any of their family members, for example, then the next best solution is to just give the land to another white person. So this creates a phenomenon in American society, specifically in the South, in which it was the case that certain white people who had like no political power, who had no status of importance, no influence, no nothing, but survived beyond the end of the Civil War, suddenly inherit plantations from the US government. And on the plantation or on the deed, on the order, is that they are to kick out all of the Black people here. Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. Not Andrew Jackson, Andrew Johnson. But yes, Andrew Jackson is described as one of the most corrupt presidents in the history of the United States. I would say Donald Trump is probably number one now. But yes, Andrew Johnson. Okay. And so where is this coming from? Why is it that Andrew Johnson would do this? Well, allow his actions to speak for himself. He starts pardoning these former Confederates. So now, not only is it that treason to some extent was technically a crime that was committed by by the Confederates, but they're being pardoned for that. Okay, and in addition to being pardoned, he's specifically targeting these people in order to give them all of this abandoned land. Okay, so does this sound familiar? A president who has a political orientation of some kind. You can't really call him conservative, but I would describe him as conservative, seeing how his actions were to try to reconstruct slavery in a way that does not violate the Constitution. But here's where we're at. Okay. So essentially, he's ordering all of these Black people to abandon all of the land that they were about to inherit. Black people end up leaving without housing, without shelter, without assistance, without money. A few of them know how to read, a few of them know how to negotiate labor contracts, but really, they're just back at square one. And yet, the Freedmen's Bureau is still obligated to fulfill this mission. As long as they don't fulfill the mission, they can't really stop. Okay. So, what ends up happening is now that the Freedmen's Bureau, their hands are tied here, but they still have a job to do. They're essentially engaging in shortcuts now. Okay. So, in essence, they go, well, if we can't give these Black people the land they used to work on, then maybe we'll just give them like access to some other land that is not currently inhabited by white people or any people. So what ends up happening is Congress sets aside nearly 1 million acres of like swamp marshes in the South. That they would say essentially then we fulfilled the mission because we're giving Black people all of this swamp marsh land and they can do with it what they want. And even though it's uninhabitable, at least we've given them some kind of land. And then if they want to live there, they can live there. But these swamp marshes are like unsuitable for farming. They're unsuitable for growing really anything. There's lots of bugs and mosquitoes. It's not really a habitable area for any human being. Okay. So this is Congress's way of essentially going, well, we've done all we can do. Sorry, we can't really do any more. Um, and so some black people try to take the land, cultivate it, build a house on it, tried to do something, but it's simply uninhabitable. So it's essentially a symbolic gesture that goes nowhere. That to some extent you could say, oh, well, we did what we were supposed to do to set black people up for success in the South, and we've done our job. And it doesn't do anything. So most black people remain without land, without food, without shelter, without assistance, and they're essentially forced to return back to plantations that are now owned by white people yet again, and to figure out how they can do the work that would at least earn them some kind of stability. And essentially, this is like they're basically getting pushed back into slavery. That's essentially what this is. Okay. We won't call it slavery anymore, right? So what's happening now is Andrew Johnson is trying to like through executive order, through some other things, he's trying to create a circumstance in which it is illegal for black people to exist in the random wilds of the United States of America. Okay. Um, Essentially, they're not allowed the freedom to roam or to do what they want on their own lands, but that the only place that the law won't be enforced against them is as long as they exist on some kind of plantation. Okay. So then the Bureau and Andrew Johnson is trying to just finish the mission, force these black people to sign labor contracts with white landowners, even if those labor contracts are exploitative. Okay. And then in certain cases, landowners aren't even willing to pay the black people for their labor. Okay. The only way they're really going to compensate black people for the work they're doing on this plantation is to say that you can have a small percentage of the crop that you can then use for your own raw materials, goods, and consumption purposes. Okay. So lots of black families here are just really being cheated out of being treated fairly. And who's going to treat them fairly in this society? Because the norm, the status quo, obviously, is that black people are lesser than. So, to some extent, any political actions in this regard, major political actions, will seek to kind of maintain the status quo here. Let me take a sip of water really quick. Okay. So, even though we have emancipation on the table, black people still really aren't free. They're if anything, right now they're beginning to face these random vitriolic attacks against white people who don't like the idea that they're seeing black people outside of a plantation. So the church becomes like a bastion of safety and community for lots of black people, not only to fulfill their spiritual needs or to experience community or a sense of compassion, but also that to some extent they're free from white supervision. They're free from the scrutiny and random attacks that white people might have on them. Okay. So it becomes a thing where, like, I know in the modern era, I hear this all the time of like, there's some black people who criticize the black church and black Christianity and like, oh, how do you worship the slave master's God or something to that effect? And the reality is that even though one could have very valid criticisms of Christianity, especially as it relates to race relations in America, lots of black people are their only place of safety is in the church, right? Their only place of safety is in the church. So you can then realistically imagine that as their identities are developing in a post-slavery America, part of that identity will inevitably be fundamentally Christian. Okay. Because that is kind of the culture norm, but also it becomes a staple for Black identity in America. Okay, so this is where a lot of that like religious fervor among some Black people has its roots too, and those roots go well beyond emancipation, as we've talked about. You know, the rise of evangelical Christianity across the Bible Belt It goes all the way back into the slave era itself. Okay. Um, the other thing here around the topic of education is, as I said, this is like a refugee crisis. And in the middle of a refugee crisis, some of the most vital, most important people to contribute to that effort are going to be the people who just volunteer, right? And in volunteering, that means then that you have like teachers who are volunteering their services to go down into the South. They're generally called carpetbaggers, people who put all of their belongings when they were living in the North into a carpet bag, throw it over their shoulder, and simply move down south and aid in the refugee effort. Okay. So essentially, here, this early notion of freedom in American society is actually synonymous with having a basic level of education. Okay. And the I want to say that the ideas or the approach to this education here was that as long as Black people largely remained illiterate in American society where they're fundamentally free, then technically they are still mentally and intellectually enslaved. Okay. So the idea then is that these teachers are going down into the South and then they are trying to teach children, but also adults too, how to read. And there's a problem. Okay. The problem is that even though you have Black teachers from the North, you have white teachers from the North that are moving down into the South. Okay. And they're lending their efforts here. There's a problem when you have a teacher who takes on the position of an authority and is trying to educate older Black seniors about how they should conduct themselves, what they should and shouldn't do, what they can and can't do in American society, and what's appropriate and what isn't. So it becomes a thing where it's like if you can imagine having people as old as Donald Trump, let's think about it that way, who are just getting a taste of freedom for the first time, but are now being told, you can't do that. Stop doing that. Don't grab that. Don't say blah, blah, blah. And then you can imagine they're going, but how dare you tell me what I can and can't do? How dare you tell me that I can't blah, blah, blah? I've been doing this all my life and ain't nobody going to tell me. So it creates this phenomenon in which there's just a conflict, especially between the older students and the younger teachers around like respect, around seniority, around authority, and it kind of sows the early seeds for this notion that Black people can be like unruly, right? That like they're just they have like a flair, they have a sharp edge about them where they really just are not um diligent about their studies or something like that. They're difficult to educate. But part of it is really that all that these people have really known is enslavement. So if that's been their entire life, and then randomly one day, suddenly now they're supposed to change into and adapt to a different society, it's going to be really difficult for many of them to like modify the behaviors that allowed them to survive in the context of slavery that they can no longer do, right? So that's happening too. Okay. So you have many former slaves that are like, to some extent, they kind of resent many of these teachers. They don't like them. They see these teachers as like condescending, self-righteous. They're like paternalistic. They have, especially the Black teachers, they have like this chip on their shoulder. They think they're white or something like that. Okay. That's where all of these like racialized impressions start coming from. And so then there's like realistic tension is the idea is you want to go down and help these people and get them educated, but the reality is settling in that that's easier said than done. It's so much easier to simply say, I'm going to go down and teach these people when the reality is you're navigating a very complex behavior and psychology around formerly enslaved people. And I would go so far as to say, even though we have access to records, to writing, to documents, and testimonies from people who were enslaved, it's impossible, frankly, at this point in time, to truly understand what the world looked like from the position of a person who was enslaved. Like, what would they tell you? What are their feelings? If you could sit a former slave in a therapy session and lay that person on a couch and ask them very intimate and detailed questions about what it's like to be them, what would they tell you? Right? And it's unfortunate that I want to say, in the context of African American slavery, because slavery is not completely eradicated, in the context of African American slavery, we likely will never really truly be able to appreciate the depth of those answers. Right. Okay. Now, having said that, if you recall, yeah, they were just alive. Elena just said, "This is crazy. They were just alive." I've made mention of this before somewhere on my IG page, but I'll repeat it again. I have a great uncle. His name is Claude. He lives here in LA, and his grandparents were enslaved. Okay, and because when he was younger, he had a very intimate relationship with his grandparents, as most people do. Um, he's been able to tell me some really very human grounded stories about one of my ancestors. Her name was Margaret, and it's just one degree of separation from this person who, still alive today, knew someone who was enslaved and can tell you stories about them as if they were just here yesterday. Right. So even as I'm describing all of this, Margaret, my great great grandmother, um I don't know, count the greats, that's not the point, but my great grandmother was emancipated during this time. She was 12 years old when she was freed from enslavement. Okay. And so for him to be able to humanize her in a way that makes it feel like her presence was just in the room I was in should be a testament to tell you that even though you're looking at these black and white pictures, at no point is this like it was so long ago and we should forget about it. And in reality, it was like a blink of an eye, right? Um, um, Oh my God, wow, thank you for sharing. Can literature give us any insights? Invisible Man, Native Son. I mean, of course, literature, both fiction and nonfiction, will always be able to give you some insight. But I think it's different when you're reading these things from a book and you're limited to your own limits of your imagination versus just being able to connect with another human being, right? And so that's what I mean when I say that. Um, but getting back to my point, don't forget that just because slavery is ended in the South and Black people are largely uneducated in the South, that does not mean that that does not mean that educated Black people did not exist. Okay, so both can be true. Is that in the North, and especially in the North, where you had Black colleges, you had Black elite people or upper class people, you had Black people who had wealth and were free in America, you still had Northern colleges, Black colleges, religious societies, universities, academies, institutes of higher learning. And many of these institutes of higher learning are trying to do what they can to formulate their own forms of like what we would call today elementary and middle school level education that provide basic opportunities to learn the very basics of how to function in American society and then to build on top of that foundation. Right. So they are getting involved in the rehabilitation effort, but that rehabilitation effort often meant that Black people from the South who then had access to these institutes and academies are usually migrating from the South into the North, and then come across these things. So it's not necessarily happening for everyone. In very few cases, this is not everybody, but there were, in very few cases, there were Black people that start from like a blank page. They have like no formal education, no nothing whatsoever, but are able to master the basics. And then in mastering the basics, are building a foundation for themselves that then only after a few years or so, they're already engaging in college level work, right? High level work and assessment and research that requires competency and competency from having years of exposure to sophisticated forms of learning. So there are some examples in which, like, I don't know the history of this picture, so I'm just making a hypothetical scenario here. Take what I say with a grain of salt. But in a circumstance like this, where you have Black people who are clearly educated, clearly well put together, it is entirely possible that at least one or two of these people grew up on a plantation and started from the bottom and essentially worked their way up to equal functioning with their colleagues. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, um, the response of white Southerners to the idea that they're seeing their niggers in real time, are learning, are educated, are developing skills, are developing crafts, are employing their skills in real time, are learning to earn money, are learning to do things outside of working on the plantation, which is technically illegal in certain states if they're not under a formal labor contract. Excuse me. So many white Southerners then think that, like, educating niggers is absolutely absurd. Like, why the fuck are we doing this? Why are we spending our time teaching all of these monkeys how to do basic tricks that really only a white man can really do? Only a white man is sophisticated enough to be able to do. And part of this sentiment is not necessarily coming from, I mean, part of it, of course, is coming from a sense of racial superiority. The other part of this is really just coming from insecurity. And the reason how you know it's coming from insecurity is because these white Southerners are then going out of their way to go and burn down these schools. In certain cases, are going and shooting up the schools. They're killing teachers, they're killing students, they're burning the buildings down. Okay. And that's essentially what's happening. Two of the photos that you see here above me, um, I don't necessarily know who ARW is. I don't know who any of these artists are, but to my knowledge, these are artist recreations of real events. So in Memphis, Tennessee, right up above me, for example, there was a riot in response to Black people essentially having freedom and what appeared to be that they're developing equal status in American society. So they go and burn down a freedman schoolhouse, right? During a riot in New Orleans, you have an example of basically they go into this engineering institute. It's like a mechanics institute where they're trying to train Black people in engineering skills, and then they go in and they just shoot up the place. And so that's happening here. Teachers are getting killed, students are getting killed, buildings are getting burned down. The education effort to the refugee crisis is essentially met with hostility, contempt, suspicion. And, like, none of these white people are facing justice. And when I say face justice, I mean, like, no one's coming after them, arresting them, charging them with crimes, saying you did blah, 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 put them, basically give them a speedy trial and then put them in prison. Like, nobody's doing that. Okay. Because the common sentiment right now is essentially, in a way, you might be able to say that even though the Civil War is over, these white people are essentially trying to save America. They're doing the work that should be done in a world where niggers are no longer slaves. Okay. So you have, for example, during a very short period in time, during Reconstruction, you have Black students going to what were once white schoolhouses and then trying to go to school there. And in trying to go to school there, whites are adamantly refusing to attend any schools where Black people are somehow going to be equally present in their schoolhouses. So across the South, this starts in North Carolina, but it is essentially spreads across the South. As you get this phenomenon where, like, whenever Black students try to attend school where whites are present, the whites stop attending. And this is what creates That Southern stereotype. I talked about this last week, but the stereotype around people with Southern accents being like really stupid and really racist is because it, frankly, anytime that even a single black person showed up or they could anticipate that a black person was going to show up, they just wouldn't go to school. So boycott the school. And what ends up happening is in boycotting school, you kind of just end up making yourself stupider. You're not getting access to the same lessons, the same education, the same anything, which then over time, if sustained long enough, is going to result in, the traditional forms of stupidity that we now stereotypically associate with people who have accents and live in the South. That's how you get that. For a time, interestingly enough, in South Carolina, there were some schools where blacks and whites were taught in the same schoolhouse, but their classrooms were segregated. So that's interesting enough anyway, right? But now that black people are even getting a sign or a symptom of like just humane treatment in society, this is how you get white people lashing out against black people at random times, at all times of the day, especially at night, right? Where essentially across the nation, and I would say heavily concentrated in the South, you have white people that are like just beating black people in public, murdering them in public, raping them, usually in private. There's all kinds of riots. They go into these black communities, burn down homes, antagonize black people, especially the ones that are no longer on the plantations. Okay. Um, and so they're just not adjusting to this idea that they have to respect racial equality. I don't think it necessarily anyone has explicitly told them at this period in time that you have to give black people equal rights. So I'm using that language a little bit loosely, but I think the way that society is transitioning during this time clearly spells out that that's where that's going. It's going to a place where you can actually just treat black people like human beings. Well, these white people who are so firmly invested in the white supremacy don't have any interest in respecting that at all, and so are lashing out because they feel like they have to in order to save America. Okay. So, like I said, no one is facing prosecution here for murdering entire families or just attacking people in the public or just beating them and maiming them. That's not happening at all. Okay. And so it's creating a unique precedent in American society where you have black people for the first time in history that are gathering in churches, gathering in congregations, and are trying to figure out how they can politically move forward without continuing to face more random acts of violence. Okay. So what's interesting is we have a case scenario, not a court case, but a case, a circumstance in Syracuse, New York. Okay, where you have 154 black leaders. And when I say black leaders here, I'm not necessarily talking about elected representatives. I'm just talking about people who are considered to be respected elders and the ones who, to some extent, lead a larger congregation or a larger group of black people, informally and formally. Okay. And so they're forming these conventions. They meet up in Syracuse, New York, and they're basically having these very loud parliamentary discussions almost around what is the way forward. How do we protect our people from violence? How do we ensure that black people can just live, can focus on themselves? Black America doesn't want to necessarily be a part of white America, right? So how can we move forward in a way where we can reduce the violence while Black people continue to respect basic American traditions and tenets because they identify as American too. Okay. And so all of these debates are beginning to happen. And as they're happening, the idea starts kind of emerging that if you really want substantive change in American society and a way to protect Black people and their interests, then the only way to do so is going to be to become politically active. And being politically active doesn't necessarily mean go to a voting booth and vote, but it certainly means trying to yield influence on the political front. Okay. So the picture above me that you see here, we're not necessarily here yet, but we will be talking about it. The picture above me here are the first elected representatives, Black representatives during the Reconstruction era. Okay. All of these people who would essentially become elected representatives in office at some point in time, every single one of them was a person who was formerly enslaved. Okay. So these are the first few people, seven people who then uh-oh, run for political office and win seats. Steven says you're not on the PowerPoint. Oh, is that a joke? I thought I disappeared for a second. Maybe I'm taking that a little too literally. um, right. Um, so this is how that happens. We're not necessarily at this point in time yet. We're still in the Reconstruction era, but we're still before Black people um, run for office. He said, "No, I mean we can't see the pictures. You don't see this picture above me here. What does the screen look like? Do you want to unmute your mic for a second? It might be easier than typing."
Yeah,
Uh,
it's just showing us you, right? Just I've had this problem with Zoom when I used to work for freaking the county,
okay.
but it's not showing the PowerPoint or whatever you've got used behind you like it normally does.
All right. Let me see if I can end sharing for just a second, and then I will try again. Give me one moment. Let's see. Mm, okay, I've opened it up. Hopefully, it didn't disappear too long ago, but um, here we
Sorry,
are.
I just wanted to see the faces.
Yeah, okay. Let's see, give it a second. Okay, can you see it now?
Yep,
Okay, I'm
fixed.
sorry about that. I don't
No,
know what
no,
happened.
thank you for fixing it. I just thought
That's
I'd
okay. Yep,
thanks.
right on. Okay, so all of these people, like I said, we're not necessarily at the point in time just yet where they run for political office and start winning, but I am getting there and I'm building up to that because that happens in history. So yes, in the 1800s, in the 1860s, suddenly now formerly enslaved Black people start running for political office and winning seats. Okay, because they're led by this belief that the way to prevent anti-Black violence is essentially to run for political office. Okay, so I'm going to go a few minutes over only because I want to essentially fit this chapter into one session. So you'll have to forgive me. I don't want to cut too many chapters in half. Um, but here we are. Okay. So um, my little title here, even though I don't really fuck with Kanye anymore, but it's a little reference to Kanye, is Andrew Johnson doesn't actually care about Black people. And that's been apparent since he began pardoning Confederates. So that much should be true, right? But the idea is that Andrew Johnson initially was promising to carry forward much of the inertia that Lincoln had left behind, especially around Black freedom, Black restitution, the refugee crisis, etc. But he's being pressured by his political constituents, and to some extent, he's also just doing the thing that politicians do: is they tell people what they want to hear. Um, uh, but he's mainly concerned with just reconstructing slavery in a way that that respects the Constitution but maintains the racial hierarchy. Okay, so he's essentially trying to repair white supremacy, and in doing so, we've already talked about this. He restored land, but in the restoration of that land to traders to the Union, it's also becoming a thing now where white Southerners are kind of being their toxicity is being reinforced by the fact that the government appears to be helping them. right? That if the US government is going to help people who technically committed treason against the Union, then to some extent they can just kind of do whatever they want to. And they're kind of right. If they choose to act out or lash out in ways that are violent or murderous or something like that, that they're not going to anticipate any punishment. So they can kind of keep doing that. And if anything, they should do it on a grander scale. They should try to keep going. They should make things worse. So the corruption becomes more blatant. The toxicity becomes more blatant and in your face. Eventually, it becomes um, so volatile, yeah, kind of like the J6ers, I suppose, but it becomes so volatile that uh, essentially then Andrew Johnson's actions can be said to have some contributing force or influence on the emergence of what would later become the KKK, what would later become the political assassination attempts, etc. Okay. Um, so essentially, as Andrew Johnson is trying to reconstruct the institution of slavery in the United States of America, um, he's trying to do so in a way that respects the Constitution. And in hindsight, I don't necessarily know exactly what his political motives were when I say this, but to some extent, you might be able to interpret his political motives as being you don't necessarily want to be so quick about modifying the Constitution because it's a slippery slope to modifying any constitutional rights, right? So part of this is going to be developing a sophisticated language that allows us to maintain the institution of slavery, but by another name. Okay. And by that other name, essentially, you have state legislatures that are inspired by Andrew Johnson to start drafting what they called black codes. Okay. And the black codes are essentially a set of laws and regulations that force black people to stay on the plantation. I think I already talked about this already. See, I'm jumping ahead of my slides and everything like that. Um, but they're compelling black people as young as 2 years old to begin working on the plantation, right? Um, and they are essentially going to be apprenticed to white people. So these images here, where you see like young children either harvesting cotton or something like that, they're child laborers. And so that was at least for the United States, that was the thing at the time is essentially a child laborer is like apprenticed under white people to work under exploitative labor contracts in which they will not be paid, but they will get a share of the crop in order to sustain their life while they continue to harvest. And so essentially, it's just reconstructing slavery. Okay. We have about 10 more slides or so. I'm not going to try to go on too long, but like I said, I'm trying to condense this down to just one video here. Okay. So during the time, Johnson's Reconstruction policies were essentially that like employers are designated as masters, but they're employers, but they're masters because of the power and the ownership that they have over their land, as well as the crops and the livestock, where the employees are the servants. Okay. So we're just not using the language of slave. Okay. So now they're servants. And because they're servants, we're also going to restrict their behavior off of the plantation. And so we're crafting into law policies that say that it is illegal for Black people to loiter, it is illegal for Black people to use alcohol, whether that's like a moonshine or a beer or a wine or something like that. It's illegal for Black people to have and own firearms. They cannot go
They cannot
hunting.
go.
Uh-oh, somebody on the, yeah, turn off your mic, please. Thank you. They can't go hunting. They're not allowed to have rifles or to go hunting or to live their life in the wild where they can just survive on their own without supervision from white people. So they're not allowed to go fishing. They're not allowed to graze livestock or anything like that unless it's on a plantation or some land that's owned by another white person. Okay. And then in certain states, Black people are explicitly being prohibited from voting. They can't vote. They can't serve on juries. They can't do anything. So now that we've essentially gotten rid of slavery, it's actually not like slavery is really over. It's just a more sophisticated institution of slavery in which we just don't call them slaves anymore. Okay. And so this is the early roots of what we would begin to describe as conservatism. Okay. And they don't adopt this language just yet. So pay attention to the behaviors. The behavior is a desire to maintain the status quo. And in maintaining the status quo, it means doing what you can. Maybe that means adding extra rules. Maybe that means using alternative language, but doing what you can to make sure that the nation does not deviate too far from what we currently know to be the status quo. And so, in this context, then, it then means that where Lincoln made radical moves to eradicate the formal institution of slavery, you simply recreate slavery, but call it something else. And so, then we're describing these actions as conservative. Okay. I don't think necessarily that Andrew Johnson, I'm happy to be corrected here. Um, but I don't necessarily think that Andrew Johnson would have called himself a conservative, despite the fact that his political actions clearly spell that out. Okay. Um, in certain states, though, even though in other states black people are being explicitly prohibited from voting, there are other states that are Republican dominant. Okay, and in these Republican dominant states, you have Republicans that realize that America is kind of fractured. Some people for the longest time really wanted the abolishment of slavery, but didn't really want to deal with like the consequences or the fallout of it. So now that they're facing the reality of what the end of slavery looks like, they're a little bit pissed off that like Abraham Lincoln he did the thing. He pulled the trigger, he pressed the button, right? Um, so at the same time, you have a group of radical Republicans that is facing pressure from their own constituency. You also have radical Republicans that are facing political pressure from the Democrats because the Democrats have been sowing all of these seeds. See, look at what they did. Aren't you pissed off? Don't you want to vote Democrat? Do you want to continue to see what the Republicans pull out of their pockets and blah, blah, blah? So Republicans are in this position where they face political extinction. And in facing political extinction, the only realistic way forward for them to stay politically relevant in the United States of America in a post slavery society is if you give Black people the right to vote. And the reason why you're giving Black people the right to vote here is specifically because who are the Black people going to vote for if you give them the right to vote? They're going to be voting for the Republicans, right? The people who helped to substantively end the institution of slavery, which then means that in certain states, perhaps not most, the Republican Party can stay politically relevant, but now Black people have the right to vote. Okay. So you have a more militant group of Republicans that are, first of all, insulted by the idea that Andrew Johnson would give pardon to traitors of the Union. Okay. But also, you have radical Republicans that politically are aware that their time is coming up if they don't figure out how to stay relevant in this new America where everybody is pissed off at them specifically because of what Lincoln did. Okay. So essentially, they become very vocal and very adamant about the fact that the people who gave their lives should be able to participate in democracy. They basically doubled down on what Lincoln's dying imagination around giving Black people suffrage was. Okay. So while certain states like New York, Ohio, Kansas would essentially give prohibit Black people from voting, you also had other states like Massachusetts, Vermont, Iowa, Minnesota, that are giving Black people the right to vote. And because they're giving Black people the right to vote in those states, that essentially means that Republicans are going to hold majority in those states, right? So, as the radical Republicans are doubling down on giving Black people the right to vote in order to stay politically relevant, this leads to the development of the first Civil Rights Act. Okay. The very first Civil Rights Act was the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Okay. Isn't this interesting? There's various versions of the Civil Rights Act. The very first one was introduced by Senator Lyman Trumbull. Okay, he was one of the radical Republicans. Well, yeah, 1 year later, but you have lots of political fallout. Things are navigating. Things take time too, right? Nothing is going to happen overnight, and especially when you're talking about political processes, you have to let things play out. So essentially, we could say 1 year later. Okay. Lyman Trumbull is introducing the Civil Rights Act. Okay. And the Civil Rights Act is essentially seeking to guarantee that all people in the United States of America are guaranteed equal protections under the law. Okay. Um, and part of this is coming about is because once Lincoln formally ended slavery, that essentially then Dred Scott or the Dred Scott decision is no longer relevant. It's no longer applicable. Again, the Dred Scott decision said that enslaved black people were not citizens of the United States. Okay, and so therefore are not guaranteed to the protections that are afforded by the Constitution. Okay. Well, these black people are no longer enslaved. And as I said, and as Lincoln was kind of ideating around, they're no longer enslaved, and but they don't belong to the United States of America, so they're essentially stateless. And some of them are fighting for the Union. Some of them are fundamentally American citizens. Some radical Republicans genuinely believe in racial equality. I would say they're in the extreme minority, but you also have a group of politically opportune Republicans that recognize that if they don't give black people the right to vote, shit's going to hit the fan for them. Okay. So essentially, then they're doing a politically savvy dance right now where they really are like, they're really centering the idea about being protecting all Americans, regardless of race or skin color or something like that, guaranteeing them the right to equal protection under the law in a civil society. Okay. Now, what's interesting is there's a caveat on the civil rights bill here, and that is that everyone except Native Americans is guaranteed protections by the US government. So I want to point this out to you. Excuse me. I want to point out to you this very simple clause. This very simple clause tells you that the Civil Rights Act of 1866 wasn't necessarily about equal protections under the law. It really was a political ploy to get Black people the right to vote in order to stay politically relevant, right? Because you need to lean into the racial equality thing just enough to get your political power back, but not so much that you're now destroying the status quo in American society and especially around notions of race. I'm going to take a sip really quick. Okay. So essentially, this is the first bill here, and this is a little interesting newspaper clipping from 1866. You can kind of see Andrew Johnson has a statement up here. It's kind of cut off. Um, but this is what happens is both measures are passed in House and Senate with near unanimous votes because the center of the attention is on guaranteeing all Americans equal protection under the law. Okay. But of course, Andrew Johnson is going to veto. He vetoes, and then Congress overrules his veto, and essentially this becomes law. So now that you have a bill that essentially guarantees to some extent rights under the law or equal treatment under the law, um, Congress is now moving to try to impeach and remove Andrew Johnson. They failed to, excuse me, they failed to remove him, but they did impeach him. Okay. Oh, Tanya, welcome back. Tanya says, but didn't Republicans also terrorize black people to stop them from voting? It wasn't Republicans. The Republicans, so again, during this period in time, the Republicans here are I would describe as the grandfathers to modern progressive politics. I would describe the Democrats in the same era as the grandfather to modern conservative politics. Keep in mind that later on, about 100 years from now, the political parties switch. Their ideologies stay exactly the same, but they do end up switching. But right now, the Republicans are just interested in staying politically relevant. And in staying politically relevant, this means that you're going to have to keep a sizable majority, which means you have to give black people the right to vote. Because if you give them the right to vote, they'll start voting Republican. Okay. So that's essentially what happens. Now, in addition to passing the Civil Rights Act of 1866, Congress also moves to make sure that equal protection under the law stays consistent as a constitutional right. That it's not just a law that can be nixed or overturned or overruled or something like that, but by cementing and using race-neutral language, but cementing the precedent on the Constitution, it makes it damn near impossible to remove. So this is where you get the 14th Amendment, right? um, that it's guaranteeing everyone equal protections under the law, and that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process, right? So it's race neutral language, but it was politically strategic in order for the Republican Party to stay relevant at this period in time. Okay. So now that Congress has gotten this on the Constitution as a constitutional amendment, they are now forcing the states who are reunifying with them that in order for these states to reunify with the nation, now that the Confederacy has been disbanded, they have to accept this um, as law, and they have to officially accept it as law in order to continue with the reunification. Eventually, the states do, and this is how you end up with the 14th Amendment. Okay. So now, of course, there's opposition to this. And the opposition is almost entirely from the Democrats. Okay. And the Democrats and Andrew Johnson are denouncing it because it's very obvious politically what this actually is. It's not a bill necessarily made with the honest and sincere attempt to guarantee all Americans the equal protection, but rather just a politically savvy way to make sure that you have a sizable voter base that will keep you politically relevant moving forward. Okay. So that's how this happens. Now, the women suffragettes are upset because essentially they're kind of making the argument that according to this, then women should be allowed to vote. And yet, what we know to be true in American society, despite what the law says, is women aren't allowed suffrage. Okay. And that any women's rights are then left and limited to whatever it is that men decide and men choose. And is that necessarily fair? Well, no. But now that opens up a can of worms that later down the road in the early 1900s, that's where you finally get women's suffrage. But it comes with a constitutional debate, right? Okay. Couple more slides. We're almost done. I promise. I'm not trying to eat into your time too much. I just want to get through this. Okay. So essentially, then you have Republicans in Congress that are like wrestling over trying to impose policies that entitle black men to vote. And by virtue of entitling them to vote, also entitles them to become office holders. Excuse me. It entitles them to become office holders. And in becoming office holders, what they're doing is they're essentially entertaining this very sacrilege idea that not only is it now taboo that the white man's political willpower is being usurped by black men, but now too is the possibility that we might be living in like a banana republic almost if black people can potentially hold office. And we all know them to be intellectually inferior, culturally inferior, morally inferior, uneducated, unable to read, and you're going to allow these people to dictate the laws of a given state or a jurisdiction. Okay, so Johnson and the Democrats are fighting tooth and nail for this, but you have to keep in mind that during this time, Republicans really are leaning into the power that they hold with two-thirds majority. Okay, and so they hold two-thirds majority in House and Senate, which means that they can pass their bills, they can force themselves to stay politically relevant. Andrew Johnson and other Democrats can't really do shit to stop them because Andrew Johnson can veto, but then they'll just override his veto. And then the problem is solved. And so this is what they're doing is they are shoehorning in any policy that will allow them to stay politically relevant, despite the fact that most of white America is like really pissed off at them. Okay. So that's how that happens. Now, in terms of male suffrage, you now have a conundrum, which is when you show up to the voting booth, you have white men that are now forced to stand behind niggers, stand behind black people who were once may have been a part of their slave plantation or not, but now their vote counts similar to the white man's. And you know that when a black person shows up, just by virtue of his skin color almost, you know without a doubt that his values, his skin color represents a set of values that run contrary to the politics of the white man. Okay. And because they run counter to the politics of the white man, um, this is creating a phenomenon in which white men are increasingly pissed off that they have to show up and see that this is happening here. Okay. So now during this time period where now black people have equal protection under the law, you also have where the states are prohibiting former Confederates. Well, they allow former Confederates to vote, but the ones who are convicted felons cannot vote. Okay. Or the ones who are actively supporting the Confederacy cannot vote. Okay. Um, but this is what the landscape looks like is they're basically forced to accept that black people will begin to have some form of equal footing in American society. So what happens in this radical political landscape is essentially now you have black people that are flocking to the Republican Party. They become Republican voters in mass. And again, the Republicans during this time period, it's not about party. Party and ideology are not synonymous. The Republican Party that we are talking about here is an implicitly progressive platform. They enacted radical change in terms of slavery, in terms of US politics, in terms of democracy, and they are redirecting the trajectory of the country moving forward. Okay. We don't necessarily have conservatism officially just yet, but you do have politicians that are resistant to all of these progressive policies and are trying to undo all of these changes by trying to cement the status quo. So, right now, you have conservatism in action form. You don't necessarily have it by name officially just yet. Okay? Because they're still the Confederates, the white supremacists, the racists, the former slaveholders, they're still trying to figure out their political footing here because they can't keep the status quo. And because they can't keep the status quo while Republicans are really just engaging in a power play, they're shoehorning in whatever they can that you can essentially call the Republicans progressive, but now the Democrats really are increasingly becoming like conservative, but they're not quite there yet. Okay. So you have union leagues that are teaching black people how to read. In certain cases, like in emergency cases where a black person doesn't know how to read, literally just showing them an example ballot and then telling them which boxes to check, right? In other cases, you have these union leagues that are teaching Black people valuable skills about paying taxes, about reading, about school policies, about all of the other things that are going on here. One of the most famous ones is the Union League of Philadelphia, right? But are trying to encourage Black people to exercise their right to vote in American democracy. And what ends up happening during this time period is the Republicans become known as the nigger party. They are now the nigger party. This is this picture here that you see on the my left, your right. Um that is it's a kind of political poster from this period. But it's a political poster that essentially I think adequately describes the political landscape here because this is how they feel. The Democrat Party is for the white man and the Republican platform is for the niggers. Okay, or for the Negroes, but colloquially they would call it the Nigger Party. Okay. So what's happening here is now that black people get the right to vote, they also get the right to run for office. And Anti-black culture norms are becoming undermined, and they're becoming so undermined that especially in the South, you have white Southerners that so grimly oppose all of this radical reconstruction and progressivism. Not only are they lashing out violently, killing, maiming, and destroying, um, but they're also outraged that black people are clearly moving to try to get the same rights equal to them. And this is where they start forming their own alliances, especially former Confederates, around what they can do to stop these black people, not only from voting, but from ruining American democracy. And they don't believe themselves to be the villains here. They don't believe themselves to be the bad guys. They genuinely believe in their truest heart of hearts that they are saving the country and that this is what they have to do in order to save the country that they love and hold dear to themselves. Okay, so last slide here. Okay, this, I think, this is a statement from the provisional governor of Southern Carolina in 1865. His name was Benjamin Perry. Okay, here's how he feels about the idea that Republicans are giving black people all the opportunity to become equal citizens to or equal standing to white men. He says here, the African has been in all ages a savage or a slave. God created him inferior to the white man in form, color, and intellect, and no legislation or culture can make him his equal. Okay? And where is he getting that from? Well, part of where he's getting that from, we kind of talked about this several weeks ago, if not months ago. We talked about the history of scientific racism and how scientific racism over the course of hundreds of years has not only amplified the religious precedent for a racial hierarchy, but also the scientific one too. That it's not as if these white men simply hate black people for the sake of hating, but rather that their hate is fueled by science itself and by scientific reasoning itself. That this is what the science says. So if you can put yourself in their shoes and in their mind for just a second, you can then understand that if this is the way they see things, it is beyond absurd that any political party, let alone Republicans, the idea that these other white people are now somehow trying to introduce these monkeys, if you will, into the House and into Senate and to Congress and potentially the presidency, right? Okay? Because these are their beliefs. So this is planting what would ultimately become the early roots of American conservatism. Okay? Where the conservatism here, it's not just a random word that comes from nowhere, but rather is describing these white men who are engaged in an ongoing conservation effort. And the conservation effort is to maintain the status quo, to maintain the racial status quo. And this is how by the time we get into the lecture slides next week, we will be talking about how these people politically begin to call themselves conservative. And the reason why they're conservative is specifically in response to what the Republicans are now doing. Okay. So again, you have to distinguish party from ideology. The constant here throughout the timeline of American history is conservatism. That was always the constant. Okay. The political party switch, we will get into that by the time we get to 100 years from now. But for now, I will leave it there. And with the rest of our time, we will open up for a Q&A if anyone has questions. Yeah, Glinda.
Yeah, sorry. So I guess I'm confused about is several weeks ago you made a point to point out that the North was not this moral high ground,
Mm-mm.
but now the Republicans are on this progressive platform because they're trying to become politically kind of relevant. But how would they become politically more relevant if the platform they're running on was not something that the North was morally want would want? I don't
Yeah,
understand.
Yeah,
So
sure.
why would they bank on doing that if that's not going to be something that's going, or were they betting, oh, we think this is going to, I don't know. I don't understand that if
Yeah, sure. The Republican constituency, the voter base, for the longest time, really wanted equal treatment. They wanted, well, no, excuse me, I misspoke. They wanted abolishment of slavery. Many of them wanted the abolishment of slavery for their own economic purposes. There was a minority who wanted the abolishment of slavery, including equal treatment or racial equality. Okay. Um, but now there's this conundrum that when people finally get what they've been asking for, it turns out they actually really don't like it that much. They don't really want it that much. And the reason why they don't want it that much is because the reality of abolishment looks very different from the fantasy they had in their minds. The reality of abolishment is that Black people are actually just going to stick around. They're going to become integral members of society. And then becoming integral members of society, that means that you're going to be competing with them for jobs. It means that they're going to be competing for wages. It means that to some extent there's going to be places where they get the right to vote. It's going to be all those things. And many of these constituencies don't want that because these Black people are going to be voting against their collective interest. And we can get into the whataboutism, but the idea, the paranoia is coming from, well, what if a Black person undoes American democracy? What if a Black person suddenly says all white people have to bow to Black people when they pass them in the streets or something like that? It becomes this paranoia where now that you're on the other side of what you've been asking for, you're actually just now pissed off at the people you were pushing to do this thing. In the modern era, I would liken it to Trump voters that were so gung ho pro Trump in both terms, voted for him 3 times over, and then on the back end, where like the U.S. economy is run to shit, are like, oh, I regret voting for Trump, and oh, I wish we. Well, you got the thing you were asking for. Why are you backtracking now? It's the same thing. It's like they wanted it and then they got it. And then, yeah, and the other part of the paranoia, thank you, Jen, is what if they started treating us like we've treated them? It's coming from the racial paranoia of if you give a Black person too much political power, it's going to be reverse racism, right? So that's where that comes from. And so the only way forward, because you have a lot of white people that are pissed off at Republicans, whether Democrat or Republican, the only real way to maintain political relevance here is to just double down on what Lincoln did. Don't backtrack. Don't try to slow down the momentum. Lean into it full speed on. And in leaning into it full speed on, you've got to guarantee that Black people are U.S. citizens, that they are protected under the law equally with civil rights. And if you can do those things just on its own, Black people will vote for you because clearly you represent their interests. This is how, for the time being, the Republicans then become the nigger party. Okay. Um, Tanya says they felt the lack of melanin was superior, and they felt European form was superior to those who could absorb the sun and work with diligence. Um, yes. I just recently saw I posted an Instagram reel of this interestingly drunk white man talking about how Black culture is like gang violence and things like that. They, in essence, they do have this like inherent belief uh, that melanin, the hair color, the texture, all of that makes you biologically, spiritually, morally, and culturally inferior, and that whiteness truly is the apex of society. That it doesn't even matter if a white man doesn't have the skills or the competency to hold a specific role. The fact that he's white means that he's entitled to it. Um, and it's kind of like that. Um, Hold on, Nasir, 1 second. Elena then says, I heard some people being really triggered by Black people using the N word and not being able to use it themselves and calling that racism. I can't even begin to understand that. Yes, the complicated nature around the N word comes from the fact that Black people have reclaimed it as a term of endearment rather than as like a mark of stigma and shame. And so what happens then is Black people have reclaimed it in such a way that depending on your flavor of Black, you're then allowed to say that word. Um, and obviously it depends on the way you say it too. Um, but then other people who in other aspects of society normally have an inherent ownership and control of what happens in society by virtue of their whiteness feel left out because they don't have ownership of that word anymore, at least socially speaking, and so feel entitled to it, unlocking all of that. Um, Nasir,
Hi, yes. This kind of brings me to a topic I've actually been wanting to ask you about for a while now. So forgive me if I digress a little bit from the subject, but particularly regarding the switch, as you said, between the Democratic and Republican parties, as far as conservatism and progressivism. I was wondering if you had any insight on, I, I don't know, a phenomenon. I guess I can only, the word that I've used for it is sort of like a racist, like superposition, where I've noticed sometimes a lot of conservative pundits, if you will, or politicians, whatever, will simultaneously they'll try to justify, I guess, their own racist beliefs and own up to them to a certain extent by saying, yeah, well, maybe I am racist or it is racist, but it's okay because this, that, or the other. And then I guess if that doesn't work, then they'll go back to, well, oh no, I'm not actually racist or these beliefs aren't racist. They will sort of say that's just something that you're projecting onto me. And so I don't know. They I've noticed now. I'm not sure. I guess if you think that's something that's always been, I guess, present within American culture, or at least for a long time, or if maybe that's something that's more recent where they. I don't know. I think I've noticed a lot of time they flip flop between whether or not they actually want to
yes,
own that I guess moniker, or own that idea of that they believe in a certain amount of like some sort of racial hierarchy, or racial inferiority or
yeah.
superiority, but then sometimes at the same time they'll sort of backpedal and say, well, no, that's not actually what it is, and try to reframe it in a way I guess sounds more intellectual or otherwise.
Yes, it's called the white fragility prayer. Um, I developed this psychosocial model like years ago. Um, and it comes from I the best way I can describe it, I started studying the topic of racism not as a behavioral anomaly and like conscious dislike, but rather looking at racism as a social ecological phenomenon that permeates American society. We'll limit it to American society, although we could say everywhere. Um, and in that, when you start treating racism as an ecological phenomenon with true scientific footing, like a critical analytic perspective, you can start to like develop an anatomy of racism or like racism psychology that allows you to like describe predictive elements. And one of the predictive elements you're talking about, I I call the white fragility prayer, and it essentially goes like this. Racism exists, but not here. And if it's here, it's not me. And if it's me, I didn't mean it. And if I meant it, it's not racist or I'm not racist. That's just how it is. Now, the white fragility prayer, as I have it, is a little bit longer than that. Um, but in essence, this captures the idea that you're describing around shifting the racial narrative to always center around not being racist, while like backpedaling to some extent, right? It allows a person to essentially perpetrate traditionally racist behavior while also sidestepping the notion that they are a racist. Um, and so what ends up happening is it's not just a white thing, believe it or not, but it is primarily predictable among white identifying people. And that is because of I want to describe it as the form of like cultural inheritance. um, there's a unique racialized experience for white people that gives them a kind of predictive psychological framework in the racial sense, not necessarily in their entire being, but in terms of racism and race politics for white identifying people. There are some fundamentally predictive elements, and it remains consistent regardless of political ideology. So it doesn't matter if it's a liberal, it doesn't matter if it's a conservative, you'll tend to see the same phenomenon. And I haven't developed a paper about this just yet, but I have ideas around why this is so consistent. But until I do my diligence and scrutinize these ideas for myself, I'm not ready to publicize that information. So I will be looking to publish and get these things scrutinized by scientific minded peers. But I also understand that the work that I've done here and am sharing, they have some pretty large implications. And so I do want to make sure that before I even get them scrutinized, that I'm articulating them in the correct way. So yeah. Um, yeah, racial superposition. That's funny. Yeah. Hi, Tanya. Welcome back. Yeah, hi. Yeah, you got to unmute yourself.
I wrote a question there, and then after you
Oh,
answer that, I have another question.
okay. Tanya asked in the chat, did you discuss the colored conventions of 1831 to 1864? Why did they end with the abolishing of slavery, but existed when we weren't supposed to be able to read? Was it that only enslaved blacks were forbidden from reading? Well, yeah, enslaved blacks were forbidden from reading, specifically because of the desire to prevent a slave uprising or a slave revolt, right? So there were lots of free black people all across the America who could read and were educated. Um, I briefly discussed the colored conventions. It was literally like just in a slide, and it was touch and go. Like I said, it's really difficult to talk about every aspect of American history and to hit the nail on everything because so many things are happening at the same time. But I did mention that the colored conventions closer to 1864 is where you started getting black people navigating how you can live in America without all of the violence. And what it led to was essentially if the North wins the war, then whatever change we can get to cement black freedom is going to look like being politically active. Um, so I just touched and go. I just kind of hit and run it, but yeah, take it away.
Okay, so no, that was my first question, but then I also have a question about uh the competition that you were talking about, competing with wage laborers, but then also last year you were talking about how they were upset by having to compete with slave labor.
Yeah.
So they were both upset with having to compete with slave labor, but then also having to compete with waged labor.
Yes. It's one of those eat your cake and have it scenarios, right? Where in one sense, you're anti-slavery because you can't compete with free labor, right? If all of these factories and institutions just one day decided we're going to fire everybody and we're going to replace you with slaves, then all of these white people don't have fair wages. But now that you're like, well, we want abolishment of slavery, we want the end of slavery, then it becomes a thing where now these same employers could potentially hire black people and pay them significantly less, which then means they might default to black people for labor instead of the white people they're currently paying higher wages, right? So that becomes a thing where now it's like on one end, now that you've got the abolishment of slavery, you still don't want to compete with black people, which it's a stupid request nonetheless, but you're going to direct all of your anger at the Republicans who essentially pulled the trigger on slavery like you originally said you wanted. And like I said, I liken this scenario to what we're currently seeing in the Trump era, is you have people who were so Trump, 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 Trump is this, he's going to be great, he's the king of this cult and blah blah blah. And then on the back end now, like Tucker Carlson is like, I regret endorsing Donald Trump and I'm so sorry and please forgive me. And it's like the backtracking thing. It's a political phenomenon. I don't think it's unique to conservatism. I think if I really thought about it, I could point to some examples of like left politics on the left doing the same thing of like you finally got what you asked for and it didn't taste the way you wanted it to kind of thing. But yeah. Can I get Tanya to respond? Sorry, Stephen, I'm not trying to skip over you because you did raise your hand, but because I'm answering Tanya's question, I just yeah.
Okay, so I feel a little confused because I was under the impression that most Black people were enslaved, right? But I'm learning that there were free Black people, there were Black people that were born free, Black people that were freed,
Mm.
and now I'm hearing that there were also these conventions where Black people had these delegations and they were advocating. So I feel confused as to why we're not further along in where we are in society
No.
if we have been freed in this country.
Yeah. Yeah, so part of this, to answer your question, because you haven't been around for a few weeks, because we were talking some of the things you were saying. Now all of a sudden we have free Black people. And the last few weeks, if you go back to my YouTube page and you can watch all of that, the last few weeks we were talking about what the pre-Civil War American landscape looks like. And I have one specific chapter that I dedicate to what life looked like for free Black people. So we established that there were free Black people. We established what the economic landscape looks like. Again, I didn't necessarily mention in the previous chapters that there were these delegates and conventions and things like that. I only touched in and go here because it's really hard to condense everything down into something that you can just talk about it. Um, but yes, this is this is everything you're asking is consistent with something we've been talking about. It's just you haven't been here, and I'm not trying to guilt you for that.
That
I
was
just
one
mean,
of my fears.
yeah, yeah.
I've asked a question that's already been covered. I'm so
Okay,
embarrassed.
don't be embarrassed. You still ask good questions, but it's fine. Anyway, Stephen,
So it has been a long time since I want to say 12 years since I was in a pre-Reconstruction history class. But there were eventually in the South Black people that were elected to office, wasn't there?
yes.
Like I don't remember how long it took. How long did that take?
Essentially the moment that you get uh voter protections, I think so the 14th Amendment, I think, is birthright citizenship, and then the
Yeah,
15th Amendment is voting rights or something like that. It's the moment that you get, I didn't mention it in the slides, but it's the moment that you get the 15th Amendment that essentially I would liken it to overnight is when you start getting Republicans that are intentionally trying to run Black people on their ticket because
right.
that galvanizes the base and gets Black people to want to vote for Republicans all the more. So I would say what was it? The 15th Amendment was passed 1866. Somebody can fact check me on the year, but it's
Right.
almost immediately after the 14th Amendment and after the Civil War you start getting Black people that are running for political office,
So
and many
so
of
it
them
would
were already enslaved and
almost
previously
no
enslaved.
lag time whatsoever. I realized that
Almost none. Yeah,
the next year when I said a year later, I realized that politics take time, unfortunately.
yeah.
But yeah, I knew that I remember hearing that they
1870.
eventually did get elected to office. Yeah, it's weird that we're rehashing the 14th Amendment right now. But yeah,
Yeah.
thank you for answering that.
Yeah, thank you for asking. Yeah, so Nasir says 1870. I'll take your word for it. I don't have the fact check in front of me, but um, essentially 1870 is right around the corner from the end of the Civil War and all of this other political stuff that's happening, right? So as the Republicans are intentionally doubling down on cementing equal treatment and trying to get another sizable voter base going, it would then make sense that by 1870 once you get the 15th Amendment, Black people are running for office, and the Black people who are running for office are people who were formerly enslaved, then leading to people who survived the Civil War belong to the Confederacy. Some of them were slaveholders and have to bear witness to the fact that their niggers are running for political office, winning, and then trying to pass laws that make Black people equal to white people. you can certainly imagine then the political fallout, but we'll be talking about that in more detail next week. Um, any other questions? I'm still paying attention to the IG live chat. Kay Alexander says, "I'm so excited for your paper to come out. Thank you." I don't know if it's going to come out. Hey, I think it is still entirely plausible that a science-minded scrutiny could poke a hole in my argument. I'm fairly confident it can't, but because of I feel what are the implications of a paper like this having perhaps a significant shift on the way that we study racism in an academic context. Um, that I don't know. I want to be specific with my word choice, but I would say I have a draft of the paper. I'm not going to say I'm going to send it to you. I've sent it to people before, but I do have a draft of the paper, and I don't know. I feel like a part of it is procrastination because I'm scared. I'm scared of like rejection. I'm scared of like, is it perfect? Can I get this in? And blah blah blah. And so yes, but I know the journal I want to submit it to. I have to craft for the submission criteria, and that I'm just there right now. Yeah. Usario, Usario, are you there? No, I don't think peer reviews might screw it up. I think peer reviews are necessary. I just it's different to get scrutiny from science-minded peers, right, than it is to just get scrutiny from the public. So, submitting a paper in this regard is a little bit special to me, and so I'm taking my time with that. Usario, are you there? No, he is not there. I think he's from Brazil, if I recall. There might be some kind of lag. I remember last week.
Oh, yes, I'm here.
There you are. Okay.
Well, I have a question about racism because when it comes to racism in Brazil, we usually think that white people and black people would have the same rights, but it doesn't happen. It definitely doesn't happen here. And one day I just asked somebody a question. If we have only one thing, for example, one public transportation for everybody, one school for everybody, one hospital for everybody, maybe it could be a solution for equality. And that guy answered me, maybe, but if we have only one bus, for example, where white people and black people could take the same bus, maybe the black people would be at the back of the bus. And
Mm,
this is a kind of inequality that we can have here in
mm,
Brazil.
mm.
Does it happen the same in the US? If we have only one thing, one space for everybody, maybe uh, inside this space, this environment, this scenario, we couldn't have equality.
Yeah. Um, it happened, I want to say, around the all throughout the 1920s, 30s, all the way to the 1960s. We had segregated buses, segregated hospitals, segregated schools. Um, I've never heard the argument that like, you know, I've never heard it the way you put it. Um, but yes, we did have that kind of segregation. We no longer have that kind of segregation. But ours is more like because of the way that our laws are designed, at least theoretically speaking, to protect the interest of all human beings, regardless of what they look like, we can no longer have racial segregation in that capacity. I don't know. I've never been to Brazil. I don't know anything about Brazil. It sounds like what you're saying is that that still exists today. Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely.
So
Yeah.
so so then essentially I would say that segregating buses, hospitals, schools makes things inefficient because it means then that if I need a hospital right away, that I might have to go all the way across town or all the way across wherever just to get to the hospital I'm allowed to go to when I live next to a hospital right here, but they can't save me because I'm not the right skin color, right?
Yeah.
It's very inefficient. And history, not just history in America, but history around the world, I'm confident in saying this, has always consistently proven that racism is inefficient to a fully functioning human society. And it ties back to something very fundamental about racism itself. And that is that the concept of race is a fiction. It means that in reality, in the sort of cosmic sense, as we exist in the cosmos, there is no such thing as race. So when we segregate and we make people work harder to go somewhere else, we don't give people the same opportunities, we are inherently creating a society where it's just harder to live for people. And even though we like to think of this racist society as somehow being harder for Black people and easier for white people, it turns out that all of the ways that it's harder for Black people are the exact same ways that it's harder for white people too. And there's a broader discussion that can be had about that. But the one thing I would direct you to, I always direct people to this book. I don't even know why I'm doing. I don't do this on purpose, but if you want to know more about this topic, there is a book by Dr. Jonathan Metzl. It's called Dying of Whiteness. And he details this phenomenon very clearly and eloquently is that even the white people who have like racial animosity are usually people who are voting against their own best interest. And as time goes on, he makes a very convincing case um, that the racism they're in favor of is even hurting them, and they don't even realize it. So
But
I can only imagine in Brazil it would be the same thing.
no. The thing is, there is no segregated spaces, environments, but people are not treated equally. What I'm saying is that there is no segregated schools, hospitals, companies. People work together, but they are not treated equally. That's the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. So what you're talking about is less formal racism, right? It's more like informal racism. It's casual racism, and it's still going to produce the same outcome.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is it's inefficient. It's nonsensical. It hurts and harms everybody.
But
Yeah.
in your opinion, what
Mhm.
about what could we have more equality regarding at work, at schools? Because racism is taught.
Mhm.
We are not born racist.
Mm-mm.
Racism is taught at school, at home, in the streets. So, what's your opinion about this? How can we reduce the distance uh, that we can have more people with more rights and
Yeah.
treated more equally, in your opinion?
Yeah. I would say that even though racism is taught, we still have it now. We've discovered a phenomenon in which human beings are willing to discriminate against other human beings based purely on how they look. And that doesn't disappear. It doesn't go away if we just decide one day that we're going to get rid of racial categories. So to some extent, we have an ethical obligation to be race conscious moving forward. That from here on out, whatever we're doing in terms of hiring, school admissions, how we treat hospitals, how much we pay people, we need to keep the race factor in mind. We need to maintain race consciousness so that we are always conscientiously moving away from moving away from reproducing the same patterns of inequality that we've observed in the past.
Yeah, I got it. I got it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for. And
Yeah.
somebody asked, the favelas aren't segregated. Yeah, yeah, sure. Favelas are a poor area in Brazil, slums, just like slums. I don't know the exact word in English, but maybe slums. There is a place where not only black people live there, but also poor people, white people, black people. They don't have so many opportunities to work, to study, and especially when they go from the northeast of Brazil to the south of Brazil, Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, when they go there looking for a better quality of life, looking for better jobs, and they don't find these jobs, so they're gonna start living in these slums or favelas. So they are segregated, but not
Mm,
black, only black people, also white people too. Yeah.
mm. Okay.
Thank you, Julius, very
Thank you
much.
so much. Yeah. Yeah, Tanya.
Okay, so you said in this that in this book there's a framework in there that talks about how white people are harmed in pretty much the same ways that black people are harmed by racism.
I wouldn't say exactly the same, but the net outcome is they are harmed by their own racism, just like other people of color are. Yes.
So I have three thoughts.
Mhm.
So one, when we talk about segregation in the United States is still segregated, and the United States is segregated basically by having created this underclass called Black, and then now attaching financial segregation to the United States so that
Mhm.
certain people can't are relegated to certain financial statuses. And I guess I wanted to ask Usario about that as well, because I want to understand how the segregation shows up in Brazil, maybe in some of the same ways that it shows up over here in the United States, in that are black people, are dark-skinned people, because I saw City of God, I think it was. It's a movie that shows dark-skinned people in Brazil being chased off of the beach, etc., and also living in very dire conditions. So I know Usario said that in the favelas, there's also white people there and, mixed people, etc. But primarily, from what it is that I've heard, people of browner skin are the ones who make up the majority of the people in the favelas. And are people treated differently by merely having darker skin? And are people relegated into poverty because of the opportunities that are kept away from them, the way they're profiled by the police, and all of these other things? I guess I'm curious about that.
Rosario, would
Because
you like
don't
to
we
answer?
still have segregation, doctor? Don't we have
Well,
segregation?
yes, of course. Yeah, I mean it's just not Jim Crow segregation, but yes, there is still a highly segregated society. Rosario, are you there?
I'm here. I'm still here. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that here in Brazil, we have a miscegenation. So we come from Indians, Portuguese, and basically Afro-Brazilians, that black people from Africa. So we don't have white people originally. Yeah, there is a kind of miscegenation, the word in English, that is a mix of three people:
Mm.
Indians, Portuguese, and also African people. So when people here say that they are white people, I think that they are not white people. There is a kind. They are a result of three different people, right? First of all, I don't know if in the United States happens the same thing. And about what happens in slums or favelas, sorry, Tonya, I didn't understand well what is your question?
You said there were white people in the favelas and black people. You said that the favelas were not segregated by race. But I guess I'm trying to understand the majority of the people in the favelas, do they look a certain type of way, or is it equal, even in the
Oh,
favelas?
yeah. I got it now. Yeah. 50-50. You're saying 50-50 black people and white people, right? You're asking me if there are more black people than white people, right? Oh,
I'm
yeah,
trying to
yeah.
find out if there's segregation in Brazil based on finances, on economy.
Oh yes, absolutely, absolutely. When people go to favelas, for example, there are the majority of people there are black people, right? But there is a great amount of people who are white people. But basically, this segregation is not by by race, is by financial issues. So they go there, they live there because they haven't money. They haven't the opportunity to get a good job in society. So they are segregated. They are putting away from society. So they live in another space that just like the ordinary people could live. For example, they don't have any opportunity. But the thing is, nowadays, art in general, cinema, theater, music, they are having a kind of they have a kind of chance or condition that they can put all of these things in art. You can see a movie that in some ways can portray their reality in favela, or music, rap music or funk music, or they are creating a community, a strong community that can express themselves in some ways. So there's just like expressing in a way that it's a kind of protest. I'm living here. I have some rights. But you that live in the so-called society doesn't respect my rights, doesn't respect me.
Mm.
And but basically, trying to answer your question, Tony, basically the segregation is based on financial issues. I
All
don't
right.
know if I don't know if I could answer your question, but
No, I mean you answered my question, but when these types of topics come up in and I haven't been here in a while, but the last time I was here, like this same type of thing comes up, whether it's, Russia or Brazil or whatnot. But when you talk to the Black people in these countries, they say that they're experiencing discrimination based on their Blackness. And so I wonder if discrimination is hiding itself in economic principles that are mainly affecting people who look a certain way, so that we can say, oh, there's no official segregation. Just like I asked ChatGPT if ChatGPT, not ChatGPT, I asked Claude if Claude could recognize racial discrimination, and if it's not overt, the AI is not going to pick up on it. And I wonder if we as people sometimes do not pick up on the fact that racism by another name still smells as stink.
Mhm.
oh
I
yes,
would
yes,
say so. Yeah.
yes. I think that here in Brazil, in some parts of Brazil, for example, Rio de Janeiro, it's just like we have two different worlds. Favelas, we have a community, a world there. There are some rules, there are some kinds of expressing themselves, there are some kind of education in there. And the whole society is just another thing. Just like two different worlds. And I think to myself sometimes, if everybody was, if we could put everybody in the same situation in an island, for example, let's imagine an island that people can go are put there. Black people, white people, they need to survive there. In an example like this, or in a scenario like this, maybe people they were forced to live together as brothers and sisters, in my opinion. But in the real world, it's complicated, it's really difficult, it's really
Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
difficult.
Sure. Well, thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Um, I can't go on too much longer because we're already 8 minutes over. However, I did want to give people time to get their questions answered because I took extra time too. So I'm very sorry about that. I also want to acknowledge one specific question in the IG chat because I want to give them some time and attention to before we conclude. Kay Alexander asks, with the laws and dignity of the society, why do you think there is still such a push to systemically oppress people of color when the idea of people of color taking over and killing white people? Part of it is that it's a culture norm. The culture norm, I would describe some aspects of American culture as being maladaptive in the anthropological sense. And what I mean by that is what has become the status quo is not necessarily beneficial to what the status quo actually is. It's not even actually beneficial to the human. And so what happens is essentially the culture norm has developed around white supremacy, which then becomes the status quo. And the idea of a non-white supremacist racial society sows seeds of racial paranoia. And that racial paranoia then leads with, oh, they're going to take over. Oh, they're going to replace us. Oh, if white people become a minority, then all of these other people of color will engage in racial retribution. And the only way to prevent that from happening is to stay on top. And so it's a kind of paranoid form of thinking, which in reality, the only thing people of color, and I don't want to describe it as monolithic, but the only thing that most people of color actually want is a truly fair, just, and equal society. Um, to my knowledge, anyway, most fair-minded people are not really seeking to get racial retribution in any regard, regardless of your skin color. Um, so hopefully that at least briefly answers your question. But we're going to conclude here, and I will tell you that next week we're
There's
continuing
one
where we.
last question in the chat, Dr. Doyle.
Okay. Dr. Doyle, you're an anthropologist. What about in-group and out-group bias inherent in our ingrained behavior? There's always going to be in-group and out-group bias ingrained in our behavior. I would say that's explained larger by a primate-specific phenomenon. Primates tend to be highly social, and in the non-human primate context, they also have in-group bias and out-group bias as well. It's not necessarily something that is a phenomenon to human beings specifically. And part of our ingrained behavior is that there is a desire that if you cannot survive as an individual, then you will contribute your resources, energetic resources, or survival resources to people or individuals who at least resemble you in some way because they embody or reflect what you perceive to be your own genetic makeup. And so if your genes can't survive, then you're going to favor the survival of other people who reflect your similar genes. Psychologically, this translates to a bias in which people will naturally default to giving preferential treatment to people who look like them, even if it's not functionally relevant, necessary, effective, useful, needed, beneficial. They still have a way of defaulting to it. And this is where I say, in a functioning society in which we have somehow cultivated truly fair, just, and equal laws, practices, norms, etc., racism. In the theoretical sense, will still be a fundamental part of that because we need to maintain race consciousness in order to sustain a truly fair, just, and equal society. But that's where I'm going to go. I'm going to hit the nail on the head. If you want to follow up with me about that next week, I'm happy to do it. Like I said, we're picking up where we left off. But next week, we're talking about the origins of conservatism, how these people even began calling themselves conservative. Where did that come from? How did this white supremacy movement come about? And who were the first Black people who became elected representatives, thereby leading to the conservative movement? We'll be talking about that next week, and I look forward to having you all. I'll make sure that the slides and the readings are posted, hopefully by tomorrow, but latest by Wednesday. And then I will see you all next Sunday. Thank you so much and take care. I'll see you next week.